setup, I'm just going to explain what self-crit actually is. We often think it means it's a preemptive way or a way to caveat your achievement or the quality of who you are. So for example, it looks like in the workplace when you've made an achievement, like you've gotten a promotion or you've gotten into a team or something, there is now a norm to self-criticize, which means your response to getting that achievement is something like, oh, it's because I had great teammates, or my teammates were the ones that carried me. Or for example, like you've forgotten people's names, you say something like, oh, like I'm just bad with names, rather than like I've just like forgotten. Secondly, this is a norm that says it encourages this behavior. So what do we think that encouragement looks like? And by virtue of encouragement, it means that there is some degree of positive reinforcement that is used as a reward to encourage behavior. So I think what this looks like is, say, offering comfort or offering platitudes when you do behavior like, oh, like my teammates carry you, be like, oh no, like you're so good, you're so smart, like it's not all Angus, it's someone else. Or things like you shouldn't feel bad or whatever when you openly self-criticize. What is the comparative then in this debate? I think it just looks like self-reflection obviously still happens, but it happens privately and it doesn't happen without a reward. So for example, you're just seen as weaker, I guess, for saying that like, I did a bad thing or whatever. Or you just keep it to yourself, you tell your close friends, it's not a very sort of public performance. Cool. First argument then about why we get better behavior, and secondly, I'm going to explain why this is particularly harmful for disprivileged people. First of all, why we get better behavior. The first premise I'm going to explain in this argument is just why they get worse self-reflection or little self-reflection on their side. And the premise that I'm going to explain here is that people need to emotionally regulate after something has gone wrong or they feel bad about themselves. So on their side, what happens is that those feelings are externalized. They have to say out loud things so then so they receive comfort and they feel better. And that takes the burden off them because obviously you've got all this pent up like frustration or whatever. But then when you get placated by someone who tells you that it's okay, that vulnerability is gone. You move on with your life. You don't actually start that process of self-reflection because you don't feel like shit anymore. On our side, because you don't want to say it out loud, you start that process of self-reflection because you still feel burdened, you still feel like something is bubbling inside of you, and you still need to do that form of emotional self-regulation. What we're saying is because you can't externalize it, you just simply internalize it. What does that look like? I think it looks simply like just introspecting a little bit more. You ask yourself questions. You think about what is wrong. Also, I just think like you sometimes just self-accept something has happened. Like I think for a lot of people, it's like this is a trait that I cannot change about myself. This is something that I can't change. I might as well I might as well become a more resilient person. So I think, for example, if your flaw is like experiencing racism, obviously that's something that you need to internalize. Be like, okay, what can I do to sort of make my life sort of better? You figure out how to be resilient, and I think that is more meaningful to come to that realization yourself than getting other people to tell you that. Because often that doesn't mean a lot. I think when you internalize and you accept that to yourself, I think that's particularly important. Second of all, I think often on their side when you self-crit, those flaws now become part of your identity. Because the things that you externalize, you put out into the workplace, you put out into school, into society, becomes part of your public identity. That is the way that people perceive you. That's how they see you as a person. So that means that there's little incentive to change the way you do things. Because you're constantly getting rewarded or comforted for externalizing your emotions. That is self-crit. So I think that looks like when you talk about your weaknesses, that becomes a norm for people to accept those flaws. So that means you have little incentive to actually want to improve yourself as a person because you're literally getting rewarded for saying those things. Finally, and I think the biggest harm here is that now that becomes a part of your identity. That identity of people accepting that you're weak or the bad person now becomes the perception that you see of yourself. And that is so bad because the way that other people perceive you as your weaknesses is how you perceive yourself. You fundamentally accept it. Your brain is rewired to think that you're a weak person. And that just means from a self perspective, you don't have an incentive to change the way we perceive you because now you've been so mind-warped that you also just fundamentally believe that you're a weak person. Why then do we get better behavior on our side, besides the stuff that I've explained about how we just get more self-reflection? First of all, it's just like when you do things like apologize publicly, it often doesn't take away the burden entirely. Often you do so in quite performative ways. So for example, you just can't do much nuance when you say something to people because like it's public, you're scared of like saying too much stuff or not enough or whatever. But also you have to placate so many different people with different perceptions of you. But I think on our side, when you do so privately or you just think about it yourself, you can think a lot more deeply about what's going on. You can communicate with people directly. You can have a one-to-one conversation. I think often the problem is like when you said it out loud, like there's not a discussion that happens after that. But I think it also just means that at the point at which you've said something out loud, you feel like reparations have been made when you actually haven't done those sort of things. I think often the case when there is weaknesses or there is conflicts or whatever, they're often ongoing processes. Often after one conversation or one announcement, the problem hasn't been solved. Often these are bigger issues, which means that once at the point at which you've brought it up publicly, I think what happens is like you feel like you don't have to bring it up again, but that's obviously bad because sometimes these issues aren't resolved. But I also think it means that people start rumouring about things. When you make it a whole public ordeal, that's when people are like, oh, now such, right? Like when more people start being like, oh, this is my business, this person in the workplace has talked about this sort of stuff, you get too many people's opinions, I think that also adds to the stress that you don't want to sort of, you just kind of accept bad things and you take your comfort and you move on. Second argument then about why this is uniquely bad for disprivileged people. The first thing I'm going to explain is just bad for victims. I think victims are uniquely vulnerable, and that is the reason for why they seek out comfort and they seek out sympathy. And that's obviously bad because they often caveat what's happened. They do compliment fishing. They say things like, I'm the victim, because that's the way that this norm tells them that they seek encouragement. Why is that particularly bad? I think first of all, it just it doesn't help your self-perception, which means that people just still see you as a victim. So when you have an incentive to do things like compliment fish or say that you're a victim, because people now have a societal obligation to compliment you, but like you still obviously have those flaws. And I think that's pretty bad, because it means that people can weaponize this. They can weaponize the fact that you've said yourself that you're a weak person. It means that they can use that against you in hiring decisions. It means in court. It means that your views can twist the word that you've said because you were forced by society to say that you're weak. Second of all, I think it's just bad for disprivileged people in general for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think when there's a norm to seek social acceptance, that also just means that you have more of an incentive to put more of your flaws out into the ether, because it makes other people feel comfortable. It's a way of feeling socially validated, but obviously that's a bad way. Comparatively, I think when there are people who already have social capital, so people who are already privileged, they don't need this norm because they already have that social capital. They're less affected by that. What are the impacts of this? First of all, I just think you're treated way worse as an individual, because this norm says that it's okay for other people who treat you badly, because that's literally the way that you feel about yourself. So for example, if there was like Ashley, who's like the team leader, like white lady, and there's like Simone, who's like Asian lady, and like Simone's like, I'm not leadership material, then Ashley just straight away becomes the leader, right? And just because she's privileged, not only that she's privileged, but it also just means that other people, because they, like disprivileged people, because they feed into those narratives, make it even harder for themselves to climb up barriers, to maximize their self-potential, to reach opportunities. That's pretty bad. But second of all, I think obviously you just feel way worse about yourself. And the way that your brain gets rewired when you keep reinforcing these harms about yourself. I think that often means that you don't try your best, or it means that you don't go for opportunities in the first place. And I think because they've been ingrained into your persona and they've been ingrained into your worldview. I think on the comparative, when people think about their weaknesses more, they're more likely to come up with solutions and alternatives. They're likely to come up with support, so that they reach those opportunities in the first place and they don't count themselves out. And it's particularly meaningful for disprivileged people who already have lots of vulnerabilities and sort of the stigma placed against them. Helping them overcome that, even if it's only a little bit, I think is important. But it also just means that they're likely to reach their self-potential. You don't reinforce this norm for other people in the workplace or in society.
Woo! Thanks for that speech, First Affirmative. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome up First Negative to continue saying, or to open up Side Negative's case. Here.
Three things in the speech. First, a little bit of setup, then on why people are just much better at internalizing their emotions, and finally on why human relationships are just much better. First on setup. The first thing I want to make clear is what this self-crit narrative looks like. They try to explain that it's things like perhaps apologizing for being in the room. I would suggest that it's more like, for example, publicly criticizing yourself for the shortcoming, which just means that all of the material that they try to explain on reparations probably doesn't stand, because you're not apologizing for something that you did. It's more just pointing out a flaw that you generally have, and you're like, hey, I have this flaw, isn't that right? Which that's probably just how it's propagated. First thing I want to explain on here more structurally through is just how self-critic is propagated. It probably looks like, for example, in social circles, your friends start to do it, you start to do it. It perhaps is a reaction to selfishness. In fact, it's probably like a countervailing narrative to that thing. But it's also like just society as a whole does it. So for example, celebrities in interviews perhaps use this, perhaps influencers do it, etc., etc. The second thing is just to explain how this is internalized. And I think the first thing is, like, obviously you don't feel reward for being vulnerable, right? Like, you don't feel like a self-affirmation. It's not like you've done a good thing. Instead, it is more that you are coming out and explaining to people like what your stitch is. But it probably just looks like, for example, first displacing the narrative of the countervailing narrative of selfishness. You're explaining that perhaps in some senses you were too selfish, or some senses you were too bold and being quite vulnerable about it. But second, it's just very likely to be internalized in a very supportive environment. And obviously that is because this is a very vulnerable moment for individuals. And like within the narrative, this is still a very vulnerable thing to do, which just suggests that it's in the incentives of individuals to do this, for example, in an environment with their friends, where it's supportive, which just explains that a lot of the time when you do this, it is not a stressful thing to do. But I would suggest that because it is done in these supportive environments with friends, with family, etc., you are likely to do it well. For example, you might be very empathetic about how you do it, or you might be very truthful and vulnerable to these individuals, or you might do it in very meaningful ways. For example, trying to extend your empathy by being like, well, these are flaws that I have, I'm sure that many other people have them, which opens up the conversation to lots of people. Or for example, like, and obviously this like differs a lot from like, their world, where you can just talk a lot about, in our world exclusively, just be very vulnerable on this. Maybe it looks like you say you're working on something right now, and that's important. At the end of this setup, the last thing I want to respond to really quickly is why they explain it is bad for victims and vulnerable people. I would explain that they don't actually suggest why the disparity in their world is unique to our side. Like obviously to the extent that people by that minorities oftentimes like beat down on themselves a lot more. Obviously that's not just the narrative of self-crit that is occurring there, but it's like also other narratives of like oppression that have made people want to appease like more like like majority groups, which just suggests that they have to explain why this was unique to the group. First argument then on why people are internally just much better off. Thesis of this argument is threefold. The first is just like a very nuanced argument first about why you don't if you are already self-critical, why you internalize this really badly in their side, and if you are selfish, why you do not. And the second argument is just why you are just more likely to be introspective from that episode. First thing then is I want to frame this debate in two cases. Like, let's be nuanced here. Not everyone is self-critical automatically. Not everyone is very selfish automatically. First premise then on like why people who are already self-critical, why we win on that. The first is just to explain that often in these cases, people are just not incentivized to voice their opinions or their vulnerabilities to other people for a variety of reasons. The first is obviously because there is a countervailing narrative of selfishness in this world, which just means that people around you don't externalize their flaws, so you feel particularly vulnerable when you do so yourself. The second is because obviously like saying your flaws makes you feel like shit. Like we as humans are wired to like want to like ourselves or like to try and appease ourselves in some way. So explaining those vulnerabilities obviously is really bad for you. But the third is obviously like just in general, there is a massive human social currency to be good at things, which just explains that and naturally people don't really want to say their flaws. Which means at the end of this, you're just more likely to first still be self-critical of yourself, but second, not externalize it. For example, maybe if you got onto a great debating team, you doubt whether you were capable of that in the first place in your head instead of talking to people. Maybe it looks like after a sports match, blaming yourself for one point that you missed, and that was obviously a really bad thing. Why is our comparative much better? Two reasons. The first is just to explain that everyone symmetrically engages in our narrative. Essentially what this means is that obviously your fear of being judged by other people for being vulnerable obviously goes down massively because you see lots of people do it. You see your social circle doing it. You see influencers and celebrities doing it. And obviously that is incredibly empowering because you feel like everyone else is doing it, so you're allowed to do it. But the second reason is that it's just very cathartic to tell people things. Like this team tries to suggest that in our world we'll try and internalize it because, you don't want to tell people. But obviously the reason that you self-regulate better on our side is because it's incredibly good and cathartic to tell people, which is why it's just much easier to do self-regulation on our side. But the third is that just like there's a lot of benefits to externalizing independently of all that. Like for example, first, you just get a lot of feedback and support. Like for example, if you say like, hey, I have this flaw in one thing, maybe your friends tell you, hey, you're overcorrecting on this, you're being too harsh on yourself, or perhaps there's some merit to that and you ought to explain that. And I would suggest that in the incentives of a lot of friends to do this, just of the nature of human relations, they care about you, so they're likely to do this well. But second, you're likely just to be held accountable. If you are telling your friends like 100 times, hey, I'm like sometimes selfish, and you don't self-correct for that, obviously they're gonna pull you up for it. That's just like how it works, which just explains why people are more likely to change on the outside. But the second thing is just to explain the cases where people are selfish. Like obviously on their level, they don't explain the incentive to change in the case that an individual is like selfish, right? Because inherently they do not think that they are bad people and do not think that they have to change. We are the side that is asymmetrically able to fix this. That's for two reasons. The first is just to explain that why selfishness occurs is pretty evident, right? Like, human social stuff, it's evolutionary, you're trying to be defensive, that sort of thing. But the second thing, and more importantly, let's explain how it changes uniquely on our side. The first is the same as the last premise. Obviously, everyone is encouraged encouraged to engage in this narrative because this is just a narrative that applies symmetrically. And even if you believe in our worst case that they are performative, it's always really good that these selfish people externalize their thoughts. That's because first, you are just much more able to hold them accountable. Second, you are just, it feeds back into the narrative of people being more vulnerable. So even if this set of people don't change, there's a broader set of people that are impacted. But the third is that you're just able to get much more support. You're much more able to be judged by your friends for the internal emotions that you have, and that was obviously a really good thing. The impact at the end of this argument then is just that first, individuals just feel much better because they're able to externalize their thoughts, they can identify what flaws they have, they can get input from other people, and that was really good. And obviously that is a massive benefit because that means that we are able, as the side that is able to do things like self-regulation and able to like help ourselves develop as better people. But second, even in the worst instances of selfishness, we are able to do that. Third, the premise under here is just that people become more introspective. I would suggest the arguments here are broadly the same. People just externalize their thoughts more. It becomes normal to talk about those, and they internalize that and try and change themselves. Second argument then on why human relations are better. Two arguments under here. The first is just to explain that relationships tend to get better, and that is just because people are more open. Even if this is performative, two claims to that. The first is just to say that obviously even if you're performative, there is some element of truth that is coming out there. Like, sure, you might be like overly talking about your, oh my god, I'm the most selfish person in the world, but obviously to some extent you do believe that you are selfish. But the second thing is that, again, like you have an accountability mechanism, you put this out into the world and people are able to like tell you that you are like being performative and not actually changing yourself, and that was obviously a really good thing. But the reason why relationships just get better in general is because you're just much more able to strengthen the relationship. You do things like build trust because you talk about your vulnerabilities much more often than you would in the counterfactual. You do things like share your deepest vulnerabilities, and that was particularly important. But you also see the person for who they are because they tell you exactly what vulnerabilities they think they have, which is obviously a really great way of judging people because it shows you how they view themselves as well as how you are able to view them, which just explains that relationships as a whole get better. But secondly, empathy just gets much more better. We talk about our feelings a lot more than we already do in the status quo. In the counterfactual. Like obviously the counterfactual is just like being very cagey and not talking about your emotions. Even if people don't react well in the first instance, like they don't give you the best advice, I would suggest that it's still a good thing. It still feeds into the narrative of being open, and obviously that was great.
Thanks for that fine speech, first negative. To continue the substantive portion of side affirmative's case, I'd love to welcome up second affirmative. Here.
The way abuse functions in society is often the same. People who are victims of abuse ask themselves where in a chain of events that they made a mistake or did something wrong. They ask themselves or ask their personality brought on an event or caused an event to happen in the first place. They constantly overthink every interaction and think, well, where could I have improved to prevent that kind of action? And this theme's mitigation is incredibly weak and dismissive. They say that individuals who are victims of abuse or become an oppression will find another excuse to put themselves down anyway. But there are two reasons why this is very asymmetric. The first is, it's not just your oppressors, it's your friends as they concede at first negative, right? Everyone around you engages in a culture of self-deprecation as well. They encourage you to find your flaws. Those people who dislike you, those who like you and care about you as well. But secondly, unlike structural factors, which we kind of critique, I think, on both sides pretty well, this is harder to link to a structural factor. It's you yourself who have this flaw. It's a character trait. It's part of your identity. As opposed to saying, oh, I experienced racism. It's like, no, I was just that one person who was too lazy in that environment or too difficult in that environment in those instances. That's very important, right? Because yes, obviously we don't fix these problems on side of that's not our claim. Oftentimes that victims of abuse particularly get harmed, especially by this narrative, for the simple reason that they are the ones who can get tied themselves into knots on their own personality. And you should weigh this claim very high in the debate. Because, as I will go into later, there are so many other reasons why people don't harm their friends or aren't selfish or self-reflect. This is a relatively new norm, right? We've had hundreds of years of people doing moral teaching and education, engaged in moral development. This is the internet-driven new norm in the 21st century, as the rise suggests. They have a high burden to that's going to, change moral behavior in a unique way. Whereas on our side, it's pretty simple. This unique norm kind of imposes a burden on those who are vulnerable in society as an extra burden of self-criticism, which is already painful for all they already have. First, ask the question then, is this the difference for moral development? Because they're telling us like, well, there's a selfishness problem in society, and therefore this is going to be helpful. The first thing I want to observe here is there are a variety of norms outside of this one which prevent selfishness. The first is, in our education system, we make a big deal of teaching against this, right? Teach to share, love thy neighbor, like a lot of our structures prevent this. But secondly, for close friendships and relationships where this team like launches the benefit, you don't need vulnerability to tell someone. You already trust them it's next to an outside of the house, right? You have a close friend and you're a bit selfish. They know you the best, they're aware, they've seen your behavior. They're willing to call you out regardless if you admit to them in the first place, right? It's not like a requirement. And this team hedges all of the benefits on close relationships and friendships. Clearly is the most central aspect of this debate. But secondly, I would say that there are still obvious norms that apologies help the perpetrator themselves. It gives you catharsis to apologize, to discuss things. The norms of conversing to solve problems is better than, bottling stuff up across all of the media and education systems as well. But also, people aren't as, most people even are selfish, are not themselves evil. They just committed a selfish act. They want to heal other people. There's also reasons to, heal and move on because it makes everyone's life better, it makes it less awkward and cold. That's what suggests all those analyses suggest then. This team has an extreme burden to explain why you require public self-criticism to solve selfishness, why it's a requirement to use the close relationship this team suggests are most important. But also, we explain the public nature of this is flipped, because when you publicly, engage in this kind of self-criticism, it forms a core part, forms a core part of your identity. Why is this the case? Well, first of all, as we explained in Jade's speech, it's a cognitive reinforcement, right? If you keep telling yourself as a refrain in conversation that you have this flaw, clearly, you'll believe it to yourself to some extent, right? And it makes it harder to solve the flaw. You keep reinforcing, I am lazy, or I am bad with names, those kinds of stuff. It's hard to solve it because you keep reminding yourself that it exists, it creates a burden and reinforces it. But secondly, as we explained, other people believe this now, and it forms a part of your relationship externally, right? That's very, very important when you solve moral problems. You don't think, that person has a reputation for X. It's hard to get around that, even if you are good faith and want to solve problems in the best case. But I think thirdly, and most importantly, it creates a burden on yourself. Because you have gotten comfort and understanding by saying, I know this is part of myself. Checking that out is very difficult at this point now, because you have to keep relying on it in social situations. That just explained that even though it's not a big delta for solving selfishness, it's a huge delta for your people's themselves moral development when they attach themselves as an identity. And you shouldn't believe this is the way this is internalized, because as they explain at first negative, it's often based on deep retrospects, where myself can I find this flaw? And as we explained at first affirmative, it's often linked to things like identity and linked to things like your race, your background, and stuff like that. Those are inseparable. That should explain, therefore, that for moral development, people who are selfish or selfishness, not a big deal. The final thing I want to observe about selfishness, though, is that this team is very lazy in how they explain people who are selfish can latch onto this norm. First of all, this norm allows them to pick apart their opponents as well. Like if you are someone who engages in a selfish interaction, you make a mean to someone, this norm means you can say, but that person has this trait, or they admitted this trait to me in the conversation, you can obfuscate very easily. So for the most selfish people, ones who actually are not very nice in the world, this is not the delta at all. Often it's flipped. They can obfuscate much easier on their side of the house and have them point to flaws in their opponents, and stuff like that. But also, this team is contingent on them choosing the right flaw for yourself. But if you're someone who is so selfish that all the other norms that I explained earlier in my speech are ineffective for you, you can just latch onto the wrong flaw in this situation, and if it's unclear how you be able to, in retrospect, accurately find the accurate flaw. If all the norms I explained around education, incentives are enough for you, why do you choose the right flaw with this norm of self-criticism? Deeply unclear to me in this case. Actually, the reason why it's not, because we explain the public nature of this difference in self-criticism makes that difficult for a series of reasons. First of all, you have to mediate that reflection across people's reactions, right? If you want to honestly self-reflect about yourself, on your kinds of flaws, why do people think about those flaws? They will interpret them. Actually muddies the waters in that case, right? Is this flaw popular? Is this flaw going to cause an overreaction? Is this flaw what my friends say this flaw is? That is a problem for active self-reflection, because you depend on that feedback. It's coming from very public sources, as opposed to just your comments saying it's symmetric. But also, not even more than that, the reactions are scattered in public as well. The more rumors, more reputation harm, all these kind of issues. So you fear that, I'm going to minimize my self-reflection because I might get attacked for or stuff like that. You pick a more popular or easy flaw to get away from it. That's very harmful for self-reflection. And no, the public nature of this norm is the one unique aspect of this norm, right? Talking with your close friends and saying, oh, you know, I have an issue, can I solve it? Oh, I'm sorry, my close friend, you should stop doing this. That is not the delta in this debate. The public nature of this norm is the delta in this debate. The idea like a public hearing, I'm saying the kind of public hearing, is preferable as well. That should explain, therefore, that for the people who are the most selfish in this debate, the ones who, you know, don't care and this is not enough for them, actually makes it worse. And for those who are victims of, you know, gross abuses, this makes it a lot worse as well. Finally, when we engage more with their claims from close relationships, again, as we explained, this is just deeply symmetric, right? Close relationships are built on trust in the majority of instances. You don't need a norm to share stuff. The reason you get a relationship in the first place is to be vulnerable and share information. So that's just the nature of it as well. But finally, I want to flip this as well. In close relationships, this means you often just search for flaws that are not there. Because often what you do now is that you feel like, I can't own the things I'm good at. I have to, you know, I guess put caveats on them to feel more humble, feel more humiliated, like feel less arrogant in these situations. So you kind of search for things that are not there. You often, like, you know, play down your achievements. And that's bad because honesty in a relationship is the most important thing. Who's good at what aspect of a relationship? Who's good at communication? Who's not good at communication? If you're constantly playing down yourself, you know, to fulfill a norm outside of that closeness which we find is symmetric, that is a very harmful relationship as well. For all those reasons, I'm proud to affirm.
Thanks, second affirmative, for that fine speech. I'd like to welcome up second negative to continue the substantive portion of side negative's case. Hear, hear. Lukas. Oops.
All good? I want to start this speech with 3 characterizational observations, each of which takes out large chunks of text. The first is, what does public mean? Because it is unlikely to be truly the word public opinion, and that's for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it is a regret the rise of. We all look empirically at what this narrative actually is, and it is not you should tell absolutely everyone, including people you don't like, including your boss, about your insecurities. It is things like close relationships, I'll deal with Angus as well as that later. But secondly, this kind of narrative where you just should tell people you're not particularly comfortable with about these things is just something that 99% of people won't do, and something that people often don't even have the capacity to do, which suggests it's another reason the narrative that's not going to be pushed. But thirdly, even if that was a narrative that was pushed, it's incredibly unlikely to be internalized by people. That's just because that is a very uncomfortable thing to do, which means even if the narrative is you should be super open and public about your insecurities, the way it's going to be internalized in action is far more likely to be. I'm going to talk to people close to me about this. The first thing this takes out is their claim of your comfort being undermined by having too many opinions and just opinions of people you don't value. Because incredibly unclear there's going to be a particularly large number of people, or a particularly large number of people you don't want the opinions of. Obviously, you selectively share. The second thing takes out their claim that people like bosses now justify in treating you badly. Because you're now incredibly unlikely to ever tell those kinds of people and be vulnerable with those kinds of people about your insecurities. But I also note they're incredibly tense here, because their own claims about positive reinforcement or suggest to you that in this scenario, they're going to positively reinforce you rather than treating you badly. That's incredibly unclear. The second observation I want to make is what this positive reinforcement looks like. And it's incredibly unlikely to be what they say it is, which is, no, you don't have a flaw, there's nothing going on at all, you shouldn't worry about that. And that's because these are still seen as flaws, and they are still seen as shortcomings. And people in your life have a lot of incentives to see you change for the better. Firstly, because these people do care about you and just want you to just become the best version of yourself. But secondly, because these are people who continuously interact with you, to have even a selfish incentive to want to see you personally develop. And this takes out all their stuff, as I'll get to later, about how people don't reflect because of it. The third observation is about encouraging blame. And I would say this narrative is incredibly unlikely to be internalized in a way that means you blame yourself for more issues. Firstly, because empirically this narrative is not, you should work out if it was your fault in more cases. The narrative is you should try to feel comfortable talking to people publicly and openly about your feelings and about your shortcomings. But secondly, it would just be incredibly unsavory to do so. A narrative that was continuously causing people to blame themselves is just not going to be the most likely version of this to be pushed, and it isn't the version, in addition to being the version that isn't empirically pushed. The first thing I want to talk about is why they say people reflect worse. But the first obvious problem, like the first observation here, is that they are incredibly tense because they simultaneously say that others' views and others talking about this cause you to self-reinforce and entrench your perception of your flaws. But they simultaneously say that others' positive reinforcement of you cause you to dismiss your flaws and feel like you no longer have those flaws and move past them and stop thinking about them. So they can't claim simultaneously this reinforces your flaws and also dismisses them. I'm going to explain why neither of those are the case, and it's far more likely to be something moderate. Their first claim here is that you externalize the flaw immediately, which means there's less reflection time. But the first thing is, it is just unclear that you share this immediately. You probably do reflect before you talk to people about your flaws, to collect your thoughts, etc. But also, it's also unclear why you stop doing this afterwards. People probably continue to reflect on their flaws. And it's firstly because the issues very simply don't go away after sharing them with people. But secondly, you not only think about what you said to that person, you also think about what they said, which means actually having the conversation means you think, how did I express this then? Did I express this well? How did they respond? How can I take that on board? Which actually means you're more likely to reflect in the future. They say you're placated and you think you no longer have an issue. The first thing I'll explain is that the start of my speech where I explain why this is incredibly unlikely to be you don't have an issue. It's far more likely to be, I also have experienced that issue. Here is how I dealt with it. Here's the steps you can take to do that. This is not a fundamental flaw to you. This is something that can be overcome. When that is the positive reinforcement you get, it's incredibly unlikely that you just stop caring about your issue. But secondly, flip this at first when we explain that sharing these things with people means they are far more likely to hold you accountable. First they're more likely to directly hold you accountable and say, like, how are you going with this process? They're going to encourage you to take steps. But secondly, the fact of having shared it means now you feel an additional motivation to continue to move positively, and that's just because you have shared it with someone, which means now you know someone has this flaw, so you feel a continuous motivation. They say there's little incentive to change because you're getting positively reinforced. But I would posit that the positive reinforcement you get is even greater when you are open and vulnerable and say, this is the flaw I struggled with, and these are the steps I took, and this is something I've moved past. I would note that the greatest kinds of positive reinforcement you get in society is those kind of success stories, where you say, this is something I was really anxious about and struggled with. Now I've taken these steps and I feel like I'm better at it now in my life. But also that's an additional incentive to continue to develop. And also just explain that at the point where people believe they have flaws, there will always symmetrically also just be an incentive to address these flaws and try to improve as a person. They say you internalize this as part of your identity. But the obvious problem with this claim is that the insecurities you voice to others are the ones you already have and feel. And in fact, they explain that the positive reinforcement where they say, this isn't a fundamental flaw with you, this is something you can address, is likely to be countervailing to the insecurity. They say just because you talk about it more means you see it as worse, but their own analysis tells you that when you talk about it more, people make you feel better about it, they posit solutions, they say, I also went through this, and they make you feel less alone. It's just so incredibly unlikely it's going to be self-reinforcing when their analysis tells you that in every single instance where you share, you have someone telling you that's okay, maybe it's not a flaw, but it is something that can be moved past. The most likely case here is that people do share flaws that they are genuinely worried about. They do get reinforcement that encourages them to be better, and they still continue to worry about the flaw. But people saying, I've experienced this too, does make them feel less alone. It's just so unclear that it's either going to cause them to dismiss their flaws entirely or reinforce them. Let's talk about the most anxious and doubtful people and the most discouraged people as they explain. Why is this just not the tipping point for the most anxiety? Firstly, because as I explained earlier, this narrative is incredibly unlikely to be you should attribute blame to yourself in more cases. You will probably make those calculations independently. What this is to say is that people who stew in their room and have constantly nagging thoughts just think this way anyway. And it's because of deep-rooted insecurities, it's because of a feeling of being alone, it's because of fear of judgment. And note two things here. This is not the tipping point for people to start being anxious. There's in many cases a predisposition, but also we have less of these people on our side. And that's because having grown up and had your parents share how they're working on things, seeing public figures who talk about their flaws, this just means you are far more likely to be forgiving of yourself and internalize your own flaws and worry about your own flaws less badly. Because having and worrying about flaws is more normalized. You've seen more people talk about it. It is seen as more acceptable, which means you just worry and beat yourself up less about these flaws. It's just so unintuitive to me that when a person thinks they have a flaw, the better outcome is that they constantly tell themselves they have that flaw and have no countervailing force. Their analysis is, when you believe you have a flaw, you tell people and they say, that's okay, here's how I move past it. It's just so clear to me that just having more support, just having more people around you is so much better. Then let's talk about introspection. They say people do this performatively, these are people who won't yeah, there are many people who won't expect people needs to expect won't. First thing, this is just at best mitigation, because like people who do performatively talk about their issues symmetrically don't reflect, but it's not effective mitigation for a few reasons. The first is just to be performative, even if you're only doing it because of the narrative. Still requires some level of consideration of what probably your shortcomings are to be shared with others, which means even if the initial motivation isn't particularly authentic, it doesn't preclude the consideration of telling people about things that you're struggling with in your life from being a process of self-discovery. I would argue that if people do this performatively, the process of like talking about this with someone can still actually tweak in their mind that maybe this is a genuine flaw that they have. And secondly, I would note that their point about self-reinforcement, then talking about these flaws, meaning you're more cognizant of them, actually just works for us in this case, because it means it does shift your perspective. This is to say, telling each person about the things you're working on just inclines you to work on them. And the analogy here is setting and telling people about goals motivates you to achieve them. So voicing these kinds of flaws, voicing how you plan to address them, is just positive. And I'm explaining this is uniquely beneficial in this case, and that's for two reasons. First, people who otherwise don't self-reflect and didn't self-critique are people who have high confidence and esteem to a point of excess that they don't recognize their own flaws. So more introspection is uniquely good for these people. But secondly, as we explained in setup, and I'll structurally make it now, this expression of flaws is likely to be very solution-oriented, which means this self-reinforcement is likely to lean towards positive steps. And that is because it is far more palatable to say, here's a flaw, here's how I'm addressing it, than just say, I have a flaw and I'm doing nothing about it. Which means that when you externalize this, it is far likely to be better. They say, you tell your friends anyway, and your friends call you out anyway. I'm just not sure you do. That's quite a high bar.
Thanks, second negative. To conclude the substantive portion of side affirmative's case, I would like to welcome up third affirmative. Here. Whoops. Sorry, YouTube watchers. YouTube frogs.
Encouragement actually comes from, talk about minorities, because I think that's the actual important group in the debate, but then I'm going to talk about all this stuff about talking to other people. Where does this encouragement come from? Primarily it comes from other people, because it's a norm, it's about other people are encouraging you to self-criticize in public. And why does this come from other people? Because people like it when you self-criticize, because it makes other people feel better about themselves. It might make them feel less threatened in a social scenario. And I think self-criticism is a norm that is deeply normed to the linked to the norm of humility. It makes other people feel better when you achieve things that you then self-criticize or caveat, for example. And what this looks like is when you don't self-criticize, you get criticized by haters as being too cocky or full of yourself, for example. But the important note to make here is that it often isn't people in positions of power who are encouraging or entrenching self-criticism. Because the people who are in power, your boss in the workplace or your teacher, for example, they reward excellence, they don't feel threatened by you, so they don't need you to self-criticize. And for them, it's deeply inefficient for you to be spending time caveating everything you do and speaking down on yourself all the time. And here, it is just different from honest self-reflection. For example, when you reflect on yourself, you reflect with a mentor, you do a corporate reflection process. Those things are private. Those are the things that are actually productive, for example, in a corporate scenario. And therefore aren't the things that we're talking about in this debate, because obviously their side requires them to defend public and open self-criticism. And why I explain all of this is that the norm just is not perpetuated in a symmetrical way. The people who are most affected are the ones who are vulnerable to things like public social discourse, the ones that care and are affected the most by public opinion, the ones that are vulnerable to haters or who already lack social capital, for whom the validation of their peers actually makes a difference. Those are the people who engage in self-criticism the most because they don't want to be seen as a threat, they don't want to be seen as bossy to the people around them. That's the minorities that we're talking about in the debate, and that disadvantages them further in the eyes of people in power as well. So when you're already socially marginalized, you're more likely to self-criticize, and that is seen poorly by people in positions of power because those people do not reward self-criticism, which means that minorities are all deeply screwed over in the world that they are told that in order to not be excluded, etc., they need to self-criticize. They say minorities already have other narratives that make them appease majority groups. But I would just say no. I would point to the status quo and ask you to notice that the counterfactual is stuff like, maybe it sucks, but you have to work harder to earn respect of other people. You talk about the model minority, etc. Those are often positive norms that, yes, place a lot of pressure on minorities to achieve more than their peers, etc. But it's about achieving excellence or proving yourself. And the heart here is that when you have to both self-criticize and be the model minority, that is a deeply confusing norm that stops people from achieving in the workplace and causes a lot of stress. This norm of self-criticizing makes those other expectations that they talk about far worse. For example, if you are a black woman in the workplace, you have to self-criticize way more in order to get acceptance from your peers or feel safe and comfortable in the workplace. That's the kind of behavior this norm encourages, and it screws you over because when it comes to applying for opportunities, people feel more justified in passing you over because you've already spoken badly about yourself far more than your white counterparts, for example. Next theme then, their whole case is like, well, under our side of the house, you talk to other people about your vulnerabilities. However, I think it's pretty symmetric to care about constructive relationships. You can call up your mum who has seen you since you were in diapers that you probably don't feel vulnerable towards, or people just crave vulnerability, they crave to be understood in close relationships. So, even without this norm, you probably still have levels of communication and trust with the people who are closest to you, or at the very least, if you screw somebody over, they're going to be angry at you, they're going to argue with you, or they're going to, for example, dislike you, and that encourages you to reflect as well, which just means that you should believe that all of the ideas of self-reflection and communication actually just occur incredibly symmetrically in this debate. How do we get better self-reflection under our side then? Because what they actually have to stand for is public and open self-criticism. So it's not like I'm going to my best friend high school group to talk about my problems. It's like I have to criticize myself when I'm about to do a presentation at work. I have to do it with my co-workers. I have to do it with my classmates, yeah? Those are still people who are proximate to you, but who you probably shouldn't trust to air out your deepest vulnerabilities, or who when you do air out your vulnerabilities to them, you probably aren't doing them from the position of genuine self-reflection, you're probably doing it for social capital. So, you don't reflect under self-criticism. Why? Firstly, you sit with your problems less before you announce them, which means even if you sit with them and then you talk about them, you're less likely to arrive at true breakthroughs. And the rebuttal here to their case is that you feel like you have arrived at the answer, which means you don't continue to do self-reflection after you've announced your problems. But secondly, you just announce the wrong stuff. Like you announce common or palatable flaws that are way less brave and don't take a lot of thought. Because you don't want to be ostracized because you admit that you're deeply selfish, for example. You're far more likely to be like, I feel your birthday because I'm forgetful, right? Thirdly, you don't announce the right stuff, so oftentimes you aren't being truly honest. When you announce to your classmates or your co-workers or your acquaintances, you do this because you think you'll get a social reward. You do it because of the social norm and encouragement. Therefore, if you have a genuine serious flaw, you aren't going to announce it. For example, I'm not going to say, I think I'm deeply selfish, or I think I have a huge ego. Nobody does this in the status quo, and note here that it's a regret debate. In reality, it's like, sorry, I forgot your name or your birthday, I'm forgetful, it's not because I'm selfish. Or like, sorry, I didn't try very hard, it's not because I'm lazy, it's just, I'm not opted enough, whatever. That means that people actually are avoiding the kind of actual self-reflection that this team wants to claim, and it allows you to actually diminish your weaknesses instead of actually realizing, for example, you are a deeply selfish person and reflecting on it, because now you can hide behind the label of forgetfulness, which is far less socially punished. The fourth thing, people tell you it's okay. Because, and I think it's happens for several reasons, because oftentimes you're talking to a public group, it's not like acquaintances, it's just really socially awkward, right? If someone's like criticizing themselves and fishing for compliments. So, you want to be nice to them and you want to comfort them. But also, if someone is already self-criticizing, you feel like you have less grounds to criticize them because then you just feel mean, like this person's already beating down on themselves. So it is just a way to avoid accountability, and that means you don't get any of their relationship benefits that they want to talk about. Why do we get reflection? Firstly, there is a motivator. You screw up and do wrong by people, you still experience consequences when you do the wrong thing. For example, people may dislike you, they may argue with you, they may try to break up with you, etc. So that means that you can still identify bad traits. Like, think about your report cards that you've been getting since primary school where the teacher is like, she talks too much in class. So you still get feedback, obviously, in society. When you can't just be like, fuck, I'm just forgetful, and use this as mechanisms to placate people, you have to do other stuff. You have to think, you have to change your behavior in order to make people feel like you deserve to be forgiven. It's no longer enough just to recognize the issue and be like, I'm so sorry guys, if I'm trying, I promise I'm not a bad person. The next thing then is they say this is only done in supportive environments. But firstly, that's not the motion. It's about open and public encouragement. But on our side, actually, you only keep it private. Emily explains that you don't self-criticize because you feel vulnerable and you don't publicly announce when this norm doesn't exist. That's why on our side, because of the vulnerability, you might keep it to yourself or keep it only to your loved ones. So their side is where it's a casualized criticism in workplaces or school or social scenarios. But the problem with this kind of self-criticism is that you have less accountability because you feel like you've done something already. The norm places the burden on others you have wronged to comfort you.
And they say, well, they'll call you out if you criticize over and over again but don't change. But obviously this is mitigation. Like you do just change slower when people feel like, oh, but they've recognized the problem, like they're changing. You just do a ton of self-criticism and actually avoid the problem, as I explained earlier in my speech. But on getting support, we do just get this better. The norm is that you share because there's encouragement and comfort. That builds your ego. When you have to do this from a place of genuine vulnerability, that is when you are more honest and open to feedback. That's when you're more likely to choose to go to people who actually care, rather than just acquaintances. That's when you don't just get compliments and actually get change. Very proud to propose.
Right, here.
Crazy dance, but it doesn't work. Oh, there you go. My wonderful awkward.
First thing I want to talk about is why relationships just get much better on our side. I think that this is a slam dunk for us. They try and explain that your relationships become formative and therefore you don't change. The first thing I want to point out here is to the extent that you believe their claim that people are already vulnerable with their friends, this ought not be a concern within this debate because clearly existing close relationships and friendships do not change in this debate. That is not where the delta lies. Even to the extent that you buy their characterization that people in the world just like obviously don't share their feelings on their side and are more closeted, I think we win on three reasons. The first is that we just win on new relationships. This looks like, for example, you talk about your feelings a lot sooner in the relationship. The comparative is that you just don't, you're more cagey, and obviously that just means it takes a lot more time to get to know someone, and that is bad. The second is that we just win on more regular and like non-deep relationships. Like it just looks like talking about your feelings more frequently with people, even if you're not super close with them. And obviously that is really good in terms of forming sort of closer relationships. The third is just on empathy. We explain that you become more empathetic at the point at which you are exposed to a lot of people's flaws, when you understand how they view about their vulnerabilities. And this was incredibly important, not only because first, this obviously feeds into the minorities and stuff that they try and explain, because you see that this is a vulnerability that those people internalize, but it's also just even in the worst cases when it is performative, it is still just something that is in the social discourse, and that in and of itself is so important. The win here is obviously really simple. Maybe they win in the best cases with very close relationships, but the number of relationships that you have with people just in the world is just much, much larger than very close relationships. That just means that marginal changes are incredibly important in getting to know people better. That looks like your interactions daily being better. That just looks like you being happier, and that is important. Second thing I'm going to explain then is just why you are more likely to internalize your problems while you solve them. First thing I want to point out here is just that obviously this narrative that we support exists symmetrically to all people. Like you give some vulnerability, you get some vulnerability back. And we explain to you structural reasons down the bench as to why this is true. We tell you firstly, this is in the popular discourse, everyone is doing it, so you do it too. The second, that there is just a massive harm to deflecting. If you are the one person that is vulnerable, you seem like you're being defensive, and that is bad, and it ices you out of these relationships, and that is just incredible, just a massive disincentive to not do this. Essentially, at the end of this, you all believe that one, you just like don't do things like, people have an agreed way of doing this, which means that you don't internalize it in the worst ways. But second, you are able to both receive and get feedback, and are just more generally vulnerable to a lot of people, and that was good. But we explain, we just explain actual structural reasons as to why people in their world asymmetrically are very defensive. Like they just try and hand wave it away and say, well, there are a lot of countervailing narratives, which means that maybe you're more vulnerable. But obviously, to the extent, obviously this is not a zero-sum game. Like we are just able to get people more vulnerable, which looks like more relationships and more happiness, and that is incredibly important. But it's also just like we actually explain reasons as to why people are defensive. That was obviously the thing. Which just suggests that even in their best case, even if you believe that it's things like the court of public opinion, we just get more discourse and talking about open relationships, and that is good. But the second thing is just like obviously in their claim, they try and say, well, this becomes your personality and you become really insecure. But like, I know we all like to live and debate the land, but like, let's be real here. Obviously, you don't internalize this because it looks like you saying that you have this flaw to a friend, that friend being like, why do you think that? And actually talking through it instead of their comparative, which is you think that you have this flaw and you just think, oh, this is me and this is my flaw. Clearly, we won on that point as well. Finally, we just explain a bunch of reasons as to why the reactions of other people to your flaws are good. Like, firstly, it's just a solution-oriented way of doing it. Like, they are giving you suggestions as to how to improve, and that was obviously really good in terms of actually changing your personality. But you just also have to be very vulnerable, and there is an accountability mechanism independent of all of that. So even in the worst cases where it's not done well, or like friends don't give the best advice, at least you have an accountability that you try and self-improve, and you are helping enough to do. Lastly, let's talk about victims. I think we really clearly explain why we're doing this. First, we just flip it, right? Like, they explain that self-crit is an internet norm, which suggests that, like, obviously this is not the thing that, like, caused historic oppression. And, you know, like, I thought that was pretty obvious. The second thing is just that you just, like, your friends don't try and find your flaws. Perhaps they are the ones to give you a bit of perspective and tell you, actually, this is structural reasons.
Thanks, Neg reply. To conclude the debate as a whole, affirmative reply.
Firstly, what is unique in this debate? This debate is clearly not about close friendships. Like, guys, close friends understand you in their flaws. Like, Angus calls me out on my flaws because there's trust between us. And the reason you should believe this is you're already going to reveal your weaknesses to your friends because you seek them out for advice. Like, that's the mechanism that they want to talk about. That's the power of friendship. You don't need the norm. Secondly, why do we get more self-improvement for everyone? Selfish people, non-selfish people. And this is important because, like, they need to prove this in order to get their benefit. Like, actually, they minimize their benefit quite narrowly at this point in the debate. Like, they minimize it to marginally improving the trust between new friendships. Like, that's where their case is at the moment. And I think this team does a good job at explaining why more people speak up about their weaknesses, but then they jump to, like, you get more feedback and more support and more accountability. There are a number of problems with this. First of all, I think they're missing a crucial premise that people that you tell meaningfully engage in response to unlock their benefit. It's unlikely because, as we explained to you down the bench, it's socially awkward to do so. It increases the time for both of you feeling uncomfortable for both parties. It feels as bad, like they say, and especially in the context that they talk about, if it's not a close friend, if it's a new friendship, why are you doing this? Like, it just does feel uncomfortable. And I think that is meaningfully untrue, like, especially if it's an acquaintance. So I feel like you don't actually deepen new friendships in that case. Second of all, I think we explained the roadblock. We explained that this norm says when you're saying to your friend, like, oh honey, like, you're actually really smart. That is when your obligation feels met. And that means when you, like, for example, when you apologize to most people, for most people that's like the end of the story. You don't continue the conversation after that. So that explains you should be quite dubious whether they unlock this meaningful support or, like, friendship benefit. I think we often stop the conversation there. Why do we, on the other hand, get meaningful improvement? First of all, I think we explained very neatly at Serina that without the norm, counterfactually, this is regrets today, people in positions of vulnerability now go to their close friends instead of their acquaintances to get that gratification bump. And that is important because if you believe all this team's material on how talking to your close friends is good, obviously in the counterfactual, you get way more people going to their friends, you get way more honesty, you get way more feedback, and that actually gets you, like, the improvement that you need. Yeah, and I think we explained in my speech that when people have a weakness, they obviously just do feel bad and they don't want to feel bad anymore. So we explained quite simply that there is benefit to sitting with it. So even if we have to wait a little bit of time, I do think that's meaningful. It means you introspect, you confront the pain instead of getting someone to tell you that you're doing great. And the way here is simple. Even if that hurts a little bit in the short term, I think we're able to get more self-growth in the long term for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because you don't have this sort of, like, souled feeling which this norms response provides you, I think you do things like you search for more solutions, you think about your issues in more nuanced ways, and that maximizes the chances of finding, for example, coping mechanisms, finding pathways to actual self-improvement. I think that's important. Finally, let's talk about why they harm disprivileged people and victims. I think it's very clear we emphasize affirmative. Because their mitigation is like, well, there are other reasons why minorities feel bad. This is weak for a couple of reasons. First of all, we explain that this is unique because it's reinforced by yourself, but also close people around you, not people in positions for power, which just means that they just add an extra layer of self-doubt. But secondly, it means that people in power have an extra excuse to oppress you because you themselves are giving them the excuse that you suck and that you're incompetent. They try and flip this at third affirmative, where they're like, well, people will just, like, work on their flaws more. Well, that misunderstands what we explained down the line. We explained that there is a perception harm, where people, even if at best they continue doing more hard work, that is devaluing in itself, because victims are constantly telling themselves they're constantly depreciating their work. And the next thing, the flip that they try and do is that, well, now they internalize it more and victims feel uniquely even worse. But obviously that unlocks our benefit. When you feel bad in that sense, you just go to your close friends. That unlocks that benefit. Finally, why should we weigh this issue particularly highly? I think, first of all, victims and disprivileged people just already face a ton of shit and discrimination. They have far less social capital and protection than other people are entitled to. When you open up self-criticizing these people further, when you give them more pressure to work harder and conflicting demands from different people, I know it's confusing and I think that is bad. It is an attack on their character that they shouldn't believe in themselves, and that means that they lack the self-confidence to do things like reach their potential or reach out a new opportunities. But finally, I think this is often weaponized against them. When you say that you are lazy, when you say that you have weaknesses, that gives people in positions of power the leeway to promote more discrimination, to demand more of these people. That directly affects those people in far worse ways.
Thanks everyone for the debate. Across the floor.